True Tears of Joy. Thursday, March 13, 2014. There's that well-known stereotype out there, the Asian tiger mother. Amy Chua might have had a lot to do with promoting it, but as far as I'm concerned, it isn't her invention. Anyway, as a generalization, it was pretty darn accurate in my case. Mum was short and slight, but intense and fierce as all get out. The polar opposite of my laid-back father, who was tall, slightly hunched, with a guffawing laugh. Where Dad was more than happy to let me while away hours on my sketch-pad, Mum would hound me incessantly to do my homework and practice cello, my mother's chosen instrument. She had no tolerance for my drawing at all. Noodling, she called it. Sadly, while I derived some satisfaction from doing my homework well, I'm afraid I was quite indifferent to music, and the cello in particular. I never told Mum so. I always felt it would have broken her heart, but my feelings were no doubt evident from my glacial progress, and this drove her to distraction. She simply couldn't understand my lack of drive, an absence of her own perfectionism. She kept insisting that if I applied myself, I could be truly great. As it was, I was only okay, mediocre. I think Dad understood me, though. Whenever he was home, he'd laugh, lighten the mood, put his arms around my mother's pencil-like frame, kiss her and say, "Let her be." He used to get away with it, too. He was the only one who ever could. But of course it would never last. Mum's desire to see me apply myself was relentless. As I grew into a teenager, our bickering became more and more incessant, driving a wedge not only between Mum and me, but eventually between Mum and Dad. The tension reached an apex around the time we went to Taiwan in 1991. I suppose I was at my sullen worst then. I might have gone two ways. Rebel, wag school, and become a goth. I was already trending that way. Or learn to toe the line. I did the latter. I was 14 and we hadn't travelled at all. This was 3 years before Za was born. I remember we stayed in Kaohsiung with Agong and Ama in their shop near the centre of town. They ran some sort of general store, selling everything from broom handles and candles to cheap watches, cigarettes and phone cards. The shop was in the front, and the living quarters were cramped at the back, where they had a kind of small living room and a dining, laundry, kitchen combined, and above, where we had 2 tiny box-sized rooms and a bathroom. Back then I was a typical Western teenager, indolent, self-absorbed. Initially I was appalled by the living conditions, the crowding, the smog, the noise, the dirt and grime. I couldn't fathom why anyone would live like this. In retrospect, I wonder what torture I inflicted on my poor mother. She must have been so embarrassed. I just didn't get that life didn't revolve around me, that it wasn't meant to be easy, that for my relatives it definitely wasn't easy. For example, while we were there, my auntie, Ya Ling, had to move into the same room as Agong and Ama, so that we could take hers. There was only one toilet, one sink, and one shower. Because of the limited space in the living quarters, and the fact that they had guests staying, each morning Agong would have to make breakfast on 2 gas burners out on the pavement, where the open sewer and fog of industrial solvents ensured a smell that can best be described as sickly sweet. I'd watch him making the same bland rice porridge to which we'd add pickles, dried pork, peanuts, tofu, and dried fish, anything to add a bit of taste. How I craved simple toast! Sadly, the bread there was always laced with sugar, making it essentially inedible. Sometimes Ama made pidan, fermented, blackened 1,000-year eggs, which would make me gag. I've learned to like them since, but at the time I saw them as some sort of punishment. I particularly resented the lack of both personal time and space. Not only did you have almost no physical privacy, But even if you managed to carve out some sort of space for yourself, you almost certainly wouldn't find the time to enjoy it. Basic survival made self-indulgence a practical impossibility. While working days typically started late, 9 a.m., they also ended late, usually 10 p.m. or even later. It all depended on the customers. Anything to make a sale. Life revolved around the shop. Kids didn't fare any better. I didn't do any schooling there, but I'm pretty sure I would have hated it. Classes started at 7:30 a.m. and went till 4 p.m. Then there were also extra programs that ran till the evening and often on weekends. No wonder I never saw any graffiti. The teenagers obviously had neither the time nor energy for it. I suspect that this is the sort of culture that forges most tiger mothers. They aren't just bitterly ambitious, as the stereotype would dictate. They have learned, or at least inherited, a formula for survival, hard work. And since the formula is intended for the whole family unit, it is more than a personal prescription. It is a matter of zeren. It's only now that I see Mum planned the whole Taiwan trip just for me. After all, we probably found it hard to afford the airfare at the time. And staying with Agong and Ama for 3 whole months must have been an incredible imposition, no matter how much Mum and Dad contributed, as I'm sure they did. Consider the inconvenience and logistics of bathroom use alone. I suppose Mum wanted me to realize what life was really like for most people in the world, that on a global scale my sheltered Western upbringing was the exception, not the norm, that what I had was to be appreciated, not taken for granted, and more than anything, that it wasn't all about me. It was about something bigger, family. I think it's fair to say that Mum succeeded in her grand plan, except the cello part which I gave away. I can honestly say that my life changed after that trip. I stopped thinking only of myself and accepted a wider duty. This sense of duty informed my choice to study law. It informed my choice of how to pay the bills while doing that after Mum and Dad died. It informs my decisions to this present day, and it'll probably inform my decisions in the future. As much as I don't find any pleasure in the law, I have to admit it is a heck of a lot better than being a working girl. Even though Zara is now technically an adult, I can't see myself cutting him loose any time soon. As I discussed with Dan, the hamster wheel we built for ourselves is the hardest one to get off. I suspect this is the case even if the cage door has been left wide open. To cut a long story short, my tiger mother taught me one very bitter but important lesson: to recognize that dreams and reality are two very different things. Only the latter warrants attention. That's just the way it is. I was thinking all this as I paced the empty house while Dan was away, about my dreams and how irrelevant they are to the real world. But then again, what is the real world? I used to know. Now I'm not so sure. I watched Dan leaving. He leaned in and gave me a quick peck on the lips, then went into the booth, smiled and waved, and simply vanished. It was the first time I'd seen it happen. Add one more shock to my recent experiences. Talking about shock, I can barely recall what I've been thinking for the last 2 days. It's all been a blur. I've been on autopilot for some of that time, I'm sure, putting one foot in front of the other, as I would normally do. At other times I've felt utterly bereft of energy, capacity even. None of this sits well with me. After all, I'm used to being in control, if not of my environment, then at least of myself, of my choices. For example, it's quite unsettling to find yourself crying with absolutely no forewarning. In my case, crying is normally preceded by a great deal of anger and frustration. It builds like a pressure cooker. The release valve starts whistling well before rupture. By contrast, last night I found myself talking one moment quite ordinarily and then crying the next. All it took was my own verbal admission that I felt emotionally overloaded. I knew I was in trouble as I said it. It was almost like an out-of-body experience. I heard myself saying the words, then felt the tears starting to roll. I had no control whatsoever. That in itself was unsettling. Dan has suggested that I'm suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, or shock, or both. He's probably right, of course. What would I know? You hear these words being bandied about, but they always apply to someone else. I somehow never thought they'd apply to me. I was always the tough girl, the girl with the thick skin, the one who'd experienced it all before. Like when I made the mistake once of not asking for money first, then being fobbed off repeatedly in the following week. Then getting beaten up when I finally went round to demand payment. My nose is still skew from that. Not to mention the many customers who think that women actually like rough play, i.e. assault. Or finally the times a customer forced himself onto me without any agreement, whether or not there was payment afterwards. I can already hear some people, both men and women, saying, "That's not quite the same thing as rape now, is it?" Maybe not by their definition. But here's one thing I can tell you. Your body has its own definition. Bleeding, bruises, swelling, sleeplessness, self-recrimination, and last but not least, tears. These things don't lie. Dan has been trying so hard. I can see that. He's so careful around me, tiptoeing almost. Not that I'm ungrateful. Quite the opposite. Looking back now, I can't imagine what I would have done without him, and the sanctuary he's provided. Don't mind admitting I had a mild panic attack when he said he was leaving for Perth. For a start, I couldn't help thinking it would mean trips to airports and 3 to 4 hour flights. I mean, that's the normal routine, isn't it? And I'd only had a couple of days to get used to this present madness. Then I reminded myself he was just on the other side of the booth somewhere, and he'd be back just after lunch. The locks had been changed. How bad could it be? Still, I found my hands shaking uncontrollably as I tried to make myself a cup of tea again. It's funny, in the last few months I was seeing Ian, I never felt physically afraid of him. I had some misguided idea that I could control him. I thought I had the experience after all, Wu Wei and all that. It was only after I called it off, after he was caught out lying about his wife, after Zah told me the truth about the drugs, after Highclere betrayed me, that I started to get a true sense of how dangerous the man was. You see, I was working on the assumption that Ian was an ordinary man, with the usual motivations. In other words, I assumed he was human, but he isn't. I don't know what he is. Maybe that's what unsettles me. I'd met men like him before, and breathed a sigh of relief that I'd only had to see them as a one-off. Here was someone who had both me and my livelihood by the throat, and he wasn't planning to let go. So imagine my horror when I heard the doorbell, followed by an angry hammering at the door. I stole upstairs and took a peek through the curtain. I don't think he saw me. I could see his mouth was badly swollen. He was spitting and cursing. I saw Ian take out his phone and call someone, presumably Dan. He kept scanning the windows as he spoke. For a moment he seemed to look straight at me, then he looked away to another window. Thank God for reflective glass. Then he hung up on the call and left, abruptly. Just got in his car and drove off. It was only about 3 minutes later that I heard Dan downstairs calling my name. I have to say I was deeply troubled when I saw D1. Here was someone whose life was in absolute tatters. Obviously it was his own fault, although he certainly wasn't taking any responsibility. The spectacle was compelling and terrifying at the same time. It was rather like watching a train derail. You don't want to look, yet you can't stop staring. For a brief moment, I must confess that a small part of me started to doubt Dan. After all, he and the madman on the screen were, in many senses, one and the same person. What would stop him ending up in the same boat, at least eventually? But then I sat back and watched him dealing with his alter ego, calmly, rationally, and efficiently. I compared them D1, that rambling, psychotic, self-obsessed narcissist, and Dan, the earnest, considerate, decisive friend. Now that I understand Plan 2 completely, I can also see that Dan is taking quite a risk, and it's all on my behalf. In other words, Dan is D1's very opposite. They might have started out the same, but they had become completely different people, all in a comparatively short space of time. I believe this was nothing other than by choice, a choice between looking outward or inward, considering others or ignoring them. Every single difference between the two Dans can be traced back to a single decision along these lines. Knowing what I know now, if I were to guess which decision actually tipped the scales, I'd say it was when Dan got up to help Zara and the boys with their music at the SB gig. Of course, it might have been any number of other things he did, before or after that, but it doesn't matter in the end. The important point is this: Dan got off his hamster wheel, and he did it to help someone. There was nothing in it for him, really. Impressing me, which I have to say he did, was a bonus. At least I'm fairly certain that was how he saw it. Whatever the decision was, it created the first real separation between Dan and D1, initially so tiny you'd never have picked it up. You mightn't even have picked it up after a few days, but after a week it would have become an obvious crack. In just under a month it had turned into a chasm. What happened to Dan and D1 is probably a good metaphor for each of us. I suspect we're all just a hair's breadth away from total irrevocable breakdown. The cracks are all there, dormant, waiting to be widened. I firmly believe that selfishness widens the cracks, selflessness seals them. In fact, it's probably a good metaphor for the whole of humanity. I wouldn't be the first person to note that at any moment we're only a hop, skip and jump away from reverting to the Stone Age, if not because of some global war or socio-political upheaval, then because of what we're inexorably doing to our environment. We've collectively created this giant hamster wheel, the one we call progress, and we can't seem to abandon it, despite the dire warnings of an impending cataclysm. We just keep going round and round. I thought I'd surprise Dan tonight. I told him to go down and work some more on the band's music, that I would make dinner. Ms. Domestic. What a joke. So I called Zara and asked him to go shopping for me. Of course, he had to come over first to grab my Visa card because he's essentially broke. At first I didn't have the foggiest what to make. I had to scratch my head to remember something vaguely appetizing and suitably original. In the end I settled for Nuro Mian, beef noodle soup, as my mother and Amma used to make, sort of anyway. It's a Taiwanese staple, wonton-style noodles in a beef shank broth with carrot, daikon, green onion, ginger, star anise. I sent my little brother off to an Asian grocer I know on Bouvier Street in Carlton, and when he finally got back with the shopping he told me he'd had to endure a visit from Ian earlier that day, and the previous day as well. As you'd expect, Zar said nothing. The clever boy even kept the screen door locked on both occasions, just in case. He said he'd seen Ian driving past at least one more time that afternoon. Zar seemed totally amazed that I was planning to cook. Cheeky fellow said something like, "Are you sure you want to do this, Just?" That's gratitude for you. Anyway, I got him to buy cans of beef broth while he was getting the other ingredients for me. I'm sure most people would make their own, but I have neither the time nor the inclination, and frankly I only have a vague memory of how it's done. Mum would be turning in her grave, and Amma would probably be sent to it if she were made aware of this sorry state of affairs. Oh well, I told you, I'm no cook. After dinner, Zar stayed to mix music with Dan. It seemed like they'd no sooner spooned up their last mouthfuls than they were heading down to the studio. No thanks for the meal, no nothing. And it didn't even turn out too bad. I took them down a cup of tea each and some biscotti I found in Dan's pantry, but they were both so absorbed in the screen they barely noticed. Funnily enough, I actually felt a rush of endorphins, seeing Zar bonding with an older male, both of them wearing matching headphones and talking tech stuff that would bore me to tears. Poor devil hasn't got a clue that Dan is going to have to leave quite soon. He won't even be able to know the truth. I think he'll take it badly, even though he and Dan have only just met in relative terms. Actually, I know he'll take it badly. Not all that differently to me, really. Obviously, this turned my euphoria into melancholia in the time it takes to flick a light switch. Here we were, playing some sort of happy family again. Yet it was all destined to end so soon. Finally, a little bit of domestic bliss, but oh so fleeting. So rather than torture myself with this train of thought, and the interminable boredom of watching two guys do guy stuff, I left them and went upstairs. I wasn't sleepy, so I read a book out of Frank's library on the mezzanine floor. Thankfully the man is a reader. I gather from the books left on the bedside table that Dan is too. Tsar still has absolutely no idea of what Ian did to me. In fact, he seems to have forgotten entirely about my sudden illness. He didn't even bother to ask how I was. He's quite clueless, really. I might be wrong, but I suspect he'll make a very frustrating husband or partner one day, at least in that regard. I've spoiled him too much. I can just see it. The same patterns he follows with me will repeat with some poor unfortunate girl. She'll be speaking with him and he'll pretend to listen. Then after a while she'll realize he was watching television the whole time. But for all my whinging, it is worth pointing out that he is fundamentally a good boy. He's been through a rough patch in the last few years, and I expect the lack of a father figure has affected him more profoundly than either of us ever anticipated. Sometimes I think he exaggerates his masculinity to compensate. As predictable and understandable as guys like Tsar and Dan are, Ian is a different kettle of fish altogether. When Dan got home, our conversation turned to Plan 2 almost straight away, and of course to Ian, and the difficulties inherent in manipulating the man. But Dan seems to think he has it all worked out. Apart from the audacity of the scheme, I was quite taken aback by how sophisticated Dan's lying has become. I should have guessed it from the way he erased D1. But this thing with Ian, it's on another level. The trick with any deception is to stay one step ahead of your mark at all times. That's always a tall order. With Ian, it's virtually impossible, or so I thought. According to Dan, it's more important knowing what won't work than what will. So in Ian's case, he says you start with something that would work for almost anyone. Then you assume it won't work with him, because it won't. And then you work backwards from there. It's a case of, look over there, but on a much grander scale. Now that I'm fully apprised of everything, I intend to play a role. I won't be going to the lunch, that's for certain. I'd be a bundle of nerves, despite my best intentions. It's all too early for that. I can't trust myself in such a situation. What I can trust is my resolve and my work behind the scenes. I've even added my own touch. Dan is going to buy an iPhone tomorrow. He's finally accepted that his old phone sucks. Just before midnight, I'd had enough, so I went down and shooed my brother out of the door. He seemed happy, the mixing was progressing well, and it seems Dan is on track to make the 5 p.m. deadline tomorrow. I kissed Tsar goodbye, and he drove off into the cool night air. I took Dan's hand in mine, and we headed off to bed. I suspect the poor chap fell asleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow. I haven't seen him that tired. As an aside, Dan instinctively goes to the other side of the bed now that he's swapped. The things you notice in this strange business. I hugged him from behind and tried to sleep, but couldn't. I lay awake for another 2 hours, going through all the things that might go wrong with the plan. It drove me to absolute distraction. Then there was the unfairness of having Dan sleeping so peacefully when I couldn't. I wanted to wake him so as to even things out. After all, he was the one who'd filled my head with all those thoughts. Ignorance might have been annoying, but at least it permitted a retreat into slumber. I must confess I eventually went down to the kitchen and poured myself a very, very large glass of vino, which I downed in one long, sustained act of glugging. Then I turned on the television, but it was an old analog set, nothing but haze. Shortly afterwards the alcohol went to my head, so I went back to the bedroom, and crawled in behind the motionless Dan, the room spinning above me like a helicopter rotor. I swear I fell asleep burping red wine breath into the back of the poor man's neck, but he still didn't move a muscle.